The student's calling and the teacher's role in fostering it. I've been led to understand that the concluding address at this conference is intended to be a call to arms and a pep talk that sends us forth in a frenzy of energy and optimism. I will try to fit into that tradition, but my chosen way of doing it will be a trifle unexpected. Who is this student whom I name in my title? Well, the person seated before you in your classroom, first of all. But if I change the phrase from the Christian student to the Christian scholar, as I do from time to time during the address, it is obvious that we as teachers and administrators are also included in my announced topic. We cannot be teachers without also being students. What is Chaucer's magical one-liner about the student from Oxford on the pilgrimage to Canterbury? Gladly would he learn and gladly teach. That makes him not so much the ideal student as the ideal teacher. As for my focus on our students, I can think of at least 3 reasons why it is relevant for me to address it as I stand before an audience of teachers and administrators. 1, we need to understand our students and our goals for them before we can do an optimum job of educating them. 2, we need to put ourselves in our students' shoes and understand the cultural forces that are tugging at them and potentially pulling them away from our goals for them. 3, we all need to tell students what they need to know about education and their calling as Christian students. So in a sense, I'm entrusting to you a message that you need to tell to your students about the Christian student's calling. The lay of the land for this address is as follows. 1, I will consider with you the nature of the Christian student's calling, the ideal for education that we probably all share, but will benefit from hearing restated. 2, I want to explore the virtues required for Christian students to pursue their calling, remembering that we too are scholars who need to summon the virtues that I will state. 3, I will delineate the obstacles that I think stand in the way of our students producing and practicing the virtues that I have outlined. And 4, for my peroration at the end, I will share a miscellany of my favorite Puritan quotations on the subject of teachers and teaching. First then, the ideal that I think both we and our students should be pursuing. As a starting point, I think we can agree that education, regardless of how we define the content and process of that education, is to be judged ultimately by the kind of person it produces. Education is always education of a person. To ask what kind of education is best for a young person is to ask at the same time what kind of person we desire our young people to be. We should not therefore get carried away with abstract schemes of educational theory apart from our picture of the whole and complete person that the education is designed to produce. At the very outset then, I will offer the statement that an education is adequate if it nurtures the qualities that we believe to be best in a person's life. If God wants us and our students to be all that we can be, then our educational program should be subservient to that conviction. What then constitutes the ingredients of an adequate education? Both the Bible and the Reformation tradition harbor no doubt that godliness or Christ-likeness is the main business of life and therefore of education. And education is adequate if it nurtures the soul in godliness and the mind in the knowledge that leads to godliness. This is everywhere the emphasis in Puritan thinking about education. The famous English Puritan Richard Baxter, in his Directions for Young Students for the most profitable ordering of their studying thoughts, wrote, "Remember that the chief part of your growth in knowledge is growing upward into a greater knowledge of God and into a greater love of Him and heavenly mindedness, and then in growing up to greater skill and ability and readiness to do Him service in the world." A Puritan father wrote to his son at Harvard College, "Remember the end of your life, which is coming back again to God and fellowship with God." Harvard itself, at its inception, included the rule that, quote, "Every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well that the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life," John 17, verse 3, "and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning." Best of all, in my thinking, is Milton's definition of the end of education. The end, then, of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love Him, to imitate Him, to be like Him. Notice that Milton defines education in terms of its end or goal. No doubt there are different ways to achieve a Christian education, but in the meantime, we had better not lose sight of what it is for. Albert Einstein once said that we live in an age of perfect means and confused goals. The goal that Milton envisions focuses on a person's relationship to God. It has a redemptive aspect to it, repairing and regaining, and it even partakes of the qualities of sanctification, loving God, imitating Him, being like Him. Here's one of the big ideas that is worthy of our best thought: education as sanctification, becoming like God. In regard to the question I have asked about what constitutes an adequate education, we might say that an education is adequate if it leads a student to value the things that God values, including the true, the good, and the beautiful. T.S. Eliot once said that to know what we want in education, we must know what we want in general, and we must derive our theory of education from our philosophy of life. The problem turns out to be a religious problem. This is well stated. Our conception of what is best for young people in education is governed by what we consider best for them in life. Now, as we all know, virtually all those who endorse Christian education would agree that education in godliness is the great priority in Christian education. But as we walk step in step up to that point, a great fork meets us in the pathway. At the fork, we need to decide whether education in godliness and morality is sufficient, or nearly so, or whether that is only half of the equation. My own conviction is that an adequate education is not only education in piety, but also equipping a student with skill for living all of life. Education is for all of life, both private and public. If, as I suggested earlier, our educational program must be driven by our conception of the type of person we wish to result, then our education must be comprehensive enough to cover all of life. While the person who is competent in the world but not rich toward God is a tragedy, so is the person of piety who is not skilled for life. I sometimes teach courses in which I assign some of the foundational texts on liberal learning. Classics like Milton's Of Education, Matthew Arnold's Literature and Science, John Henry Newman's Knowledge, Its Own End, and T.S. Eliot's Modern Education and the Classics. The point of greatest agreement among these essays is that education must educate the whole person and must cover the broad expanse of human knowledge, not just one area of specialty and not just religious knowledge. Milton's ideal curriculum covers all the known subject areas of his day, and his definition of the goal of a liberal or generous education is the classic statement on the topic. Milton's famous definition, the balance to his definition of specifically Christian education, is this: I call therefore a complete and generous education that which fits a person to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously all the offices, both private and public, of peace and war. Just notice the key terms: complete and all. At the heart of Milton's definition is the idea that an adequate education is comprehensive. Such an education frees one to perform skillfully in every area of life and is more than vocational training. A related point on which these educational theorists agree is that learning does not consist of the mere transfer or acquisition of data, but instead the molding of a certain kind of person. It is not mastery of data that makes an educated person, but the formation of a person whose mind possesses certain foundational skills that can be applied to any set of data. T.S. Eliot rightly claims that education is not a mere acquisition of facts, but a training of the mind as an instrument to deal with any class of facts, to reason and to apply the training obtained in one department in dealing with new ones. John Henry Newman similarly claims that the distinguishing mark of a liberal education is that, quote, a habit of mind is formed which lasts through life. Can we agree that an education is adequate not if it produces a notebook full of notes, or a good report card, or high test scores, or even a diploma, but only if it produces a habit of mind whose transferable skills include, that's a pretty long list, precision of thought and expression, ability to organize masses of data into unifying patterns, ability to move beyond description of surface details to interpretation of underlying principles, intellectual curiosity, excitement about learning something new, perseverance in pursuing an idea to its logical conclusion, humility in admitting that one does not yet know the answer to something, willingness to look something up in the dictionary or encyclopedia or on the internet, and a steadfast aversion to mental laziness. In a world that is changing as constantly as ours, training for a specific vocation or task is less adequate than education of the mind. A versatile and capable mind and full personality are qualities that will always be portable and transferable and probably marketable. 2 centuries before Newman used the formula habit of mind, the Puritan Richard Baxter had claimed aphoristically that, quote, "The habits of mind are better than the best library." As you know, it is not only humanists who value a classical education. The Reformers and Puritans were as interested in a classical and liberal arts education as they were in spiritual and moral education. While the aim of education in the Protestant tradition was religious and moral, its content was humanistic in the old meaning of that word. Protestants formed schools in order to ensure an educated clergy and a laity that could read the Bible, but they did not found what we call Bible schools or even seminaries. Instead, they established institutions that we today would recognize as Christian liberal arts schools and colleges. The Reformation goal was the integration of faith and learning, because the Reformers believed that neither theology nor human knowledge was by itself sufficient for life in the world. When Calvin devised a practical system of education, he took the view that, quote, "Although we yield the first place to the Word of God, we do not reject good training. The Word of God indeed is the foundation of all learning, but the liberal arts are aids to the full knowledge of the Word and are not to be despised." Or as Luther's colleague Philip Melanchthon put it, "Some teach absolutely nothing out of the sacred scriptures. Some teach the children absolutely nothing but the sacred scriptures, both of which are not to be tolerated." What did the Reformers and Puritans mean by a liberal education, and why did they favor it? Luther sounded the keynote in his letter to the councilmen of all cities in Germany that they establish and maintain Christian schools. Here's Luther. "If I had children and could manage it, I would have them study not only languages and history, but also singing and music, together with the whole of mathematics. The ancient Greeks trained their children in these disciplines. They grew up to be people of wondrous ability, subsequently fit for everything." Fit for everything. This has always been the goal of a liberal education, and it is what adherents of the Reformation wanted because they saw the usefulness of it. Although the Puritans stressed the need to establish colleges to ensure a learned ministry, they did not believe that a knowledge of the Bible and theology alone was adequate for the task. Thus, while the immediate occasion for the founding of Harvard College was the desire to perpetuate an educated ministry for the churches, the curriculum of the college was a classical liberal arts curriculum. Along with the usefulness of the liberal arts, there was the delight that they bring to an educated person. In his sermon on keeping children in school, Luther spoke of the pure pleasure a person gets from being liberally educated, adding that human knowledge and the arts are, quote, "noble, precious gifts that God uses to his good pleasure for the praise, honor, and glory of his holy name." As Christian humanists, the Reformers endorsed the study of both the arts and the sciences, and not just theology and the Bible. The educational ideal of Reformation Protestantism was a comprehensive study of human knowledge in all its branches within a context of biblical revelation. To return to the question I posed at the outset, what kind of education is adequate if we want the best for our children? I have suggested that an education is adequate if it educates a person for godliness and for competence in all areas of life. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, "All things are yours, and you are Christ's." Applied to the realm of education, this is an implied endorsement of the liberal arts ideal of an education for all of life, embracing all fields of knowledge. In the remainder of my address, I'm going to delineate the virtues required to be a Christian student and the obstacles that stand in the way of pursuing those virtues. My illustrations will come from what I have experienced with college students, and I want you to ponder how this might relate to you and your students. I will just say parenthetically, if all my students were from classical Christian schools, I would have very few anecdotes to share with you, but the talk would be a great deal less entertaining. I just don't want you, as devotees of classical Christian education, to feel as though I'm singling you out. You're exempt almost entirely from what I'm sharing with you. On the other hand, if the shoe fits, put it on. Students do not suddenly adopt the behaviors that I am about to delineate when they arrive on a college campus. Upon reflection, I think you will agree that what I describe is the culmination of a trajectory that began at least as far back as middle school and not impossibly in grade school. If our educational goal is education in godliness and equipping of students with skill to live all of life, what are the virtues required? I believe that the foremost virtue that my students can display is a teachable spirit. In fact, I believe that the highest commendation that I can write on a student recommendation, apart from the earnestness of a person's Christian faith, is that the person has a teachable spirit, and I often do write that. I am fond of the following statement by a Puritan: "The great things required of a student are an humble sense of our own ignorance, a teachable disposition, and readiness of mind to receive instruction." To be teachable means to be willing to learn from people, above all teachers, who have studied a subject thoroughly and have therefore earned the right to impart knowledge. I have found that students who have drunk deeply at the fountains of the self-esteem movement and the entitlement movement are quick to set themselves up as rival authorities to their teachers. A second scholarly virtue that allows one to discharge the vocation of being a Christian student is the ability to assume responsibility for one's own learning. All education is ultimately self-education. If that is true, then students need to own the deficiencies that they have in their fund of knowledge or skill. In my view, there is absolutely no ignominy in acknowledging that one does not yet know something. I find that my students often try to shift the blame to me when I judge the quality of their work to be less than perfect. Let me just say that I believe that our students will short-circuit the educational process if they set themselves up as a rival authority when teachers point out deficiencies in their work. Proverbs 13 verse 18 asserts, "Whoever heeds correction is honored." A colleague recently shared with me the experience of spending 40 minutes with a writing student, going over his paper to show the ways in which it lacked clarity and coherence of argument. At the end of the session, the student said, "Well, I disagree." I will have to say, the most egregious examples of what I'm sharing come from my writing courses. The examples are not limited to those courses, but are particularly prevalent there. A third scholarly virtue that makes the liberal arts ideal possible is intellectual curiosity. The most discernible difference between my students during the past decade and the decades before that is the loss of the thrill, once common, to be learning something new. The student's calling depends on a person's catching what I call the intellectual spark, an ability to be thrilled simply to be reading for the first time a classic text that had until that time been only a title, or an author who had only been a name, or to be initiated into a discipline that had been only a label. The Victorian scholar Walter Pater spoke of moments of insight or intellectual excitement that are irresistibly real and attractive to us. Moments of insight or intellectual excitement that are irresistibly real and attractive to us. The Victorian Catholic John Henry Newman is the classic source on knowledge being its own reward. In his book, The Idea of a University, Newman speaks of the liberal arts as forming, quote, "a habit of mind which lasts through life, and among its features is the conviction that knowledge is capable of being its own end." As for this habit of mind which lasts through life, one of the best things that an education can do for students is that they leave school being a student. A fourth virtue that makes the student's calling possible is a capacity for work, and as part of that, a capacity for self-denial. I think we need to frankly acknowledge that young people who were raised on the electronic media have an insatiable appetite to be entertained. Several years ago, I picked up on a Friday afternoon a sheet of paper that had lain near my office door in the English department for the entire week. It turned out to be a Type A student's projected schedule for the week, but notice that the schedule did the student a little good because it had been abandoned at the beginning of the week. The item in the student's schedule, and it was crammed, schedule for the week, that most captivated me was the entry for 2:00 a.m. on Thursday morning. 2 a.m. on Thursday morning. The student listed two options, either sleep or blank. Do you want to guess what the second option was? When I pose that question to small groups of students, I get a whole array of self-revealing answers. as if the unstated option were a veritable Rorschach inkblot. Very incriminating possibilities, I want to say. For this student, the options were either sleeping at 2 in the morning or watching a movie. I have this footnote based on a recent Wheaton and England experience. I started observing that this phrase, this clause, "I'm so excited," kept showing up. So then I also observed when students were using this as a formula, "I'm so excited." Well, it was not their courses about which they were, quote, "so excited." It was going to see the latest movie release. They were, quote, "so excited." I return to my point of departure. To pursue the calling of being a student requires a commitment to intellectual work, and this in turn requires one to bypass some occasions of entertainment. I was impressed recently by a comment made at a missionary commissioning at my church. A retired professor from the University of Chicago was being commissioned for short-term teaching at a seminary in Costa Rica. One of his prayer requests really struck me. "Pray that my students will work hard." God wants us to work hard in the things that matter to him, said my friend. Well, that's really worth thinking about. God wants us to work hard in the things that matter to him. The true, the good, and the beautiful matter to God. And what is Christian liberal arts education if not a pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful? What are the obstacles that stand in the way of our students pursuing their vocation of being a student as I have described it? I would say unhesitatingly that one of the biggest culprits for my students is overcommitment in scheduling, and more generally, an overstimulated lifestyle. My students try to cram everything into their schedules, and many of them become academic casualties. John Calvin said that one's calling is like a watchman or sentry to ward off forces that would otherwise divert a person from his or her vocation. A sentry. This view of vocation could be one of the biggest allies in protecting one's commitment to being a student or to being a teacher. As you can imagine, my fund of anecdote regarding stories of overcommitment is full and overflowing. It was excruciating to choose the following anecdote from The Embarrassment of Riches. I chose a note that I had found on the floor of my office when I entered it one morning. I think that you will not find it hard to believe that during 45 years of teaching, I have received my share of notes slipped surreptitiously under my door. Dr. Ryken, the note began. And I just observed with you the abruptness of that in comparison to the nice lilt, the winsome lilt of Dr. Ryken, Dr. Ryken, I do not know where to begin except I am preparing for the next test. To render this really excruciating, it was a Milton course. I tried reading late into 3 successive evenings and found myself moving in and out of consciousness. Let me pay tribute to the student for managing to do on his own what ordinarily requires sitting in my class to achieve. I returned to the note. I fell behind early after the first exam. This year I am heavily involved in the community. I'm trying to wean myself from college life, parenthesis, not studying. College is just a transition period, parenthesis, a period of preparation. That's exactly the point. It's a period of preparation and deserves our best. This term I have 4 reading courses, 20 to 30 hours in a ministry, a job, and meetings almost every night, and 2 speaking engagements a week. What was the student's problem? It was not on the surface a deficient work ethic, or was it? A healthy work ethic sets bounds to work. This person was a workaholic. He was also a ministry junkie. He was above all overscheduled and overcommitted as he pursued an overstimulated lifestyle. As harmful as overcommitment is to the vocation of being a student, there is something equally detrimental. It is the current obsession with grades. I hope you're spared it, but it could be part of your experience already. Let me contrast 2 recent responses from former students who had taken my Milton course. Recently, when attending a writers' conference, I was taken out to dinner by a former student whose daughter had also attended Wheaton and had taken my Milton course. Virtually the first thing the mother told me was that her daughter was disappointed in having gotten a B in my Milton course. This was apparently the one important thing that the daughter carried away from the course. By contrast, I received an email from someone who had taken my Milton course in the late 70s. Here's what the student wrote. Dear Dr. Ryken, I want to thank you for Well, there's a difference. You can see the difference. Dear Dr. Ryken, I want to thank you for introducing me to Milton at Wheaton. The poem that he wrote entitled On His Blindness really struck a chord with me. And since then I have remembered and reminded myself and others of his line, "They also serve who only stand and wait." A couple of weeks ago I was talking with a friend with a chronic illness who was discouraged over the very problem Milton had. I looked up his poem and sent her a copy and have mulled over its meaning in my own life too. This is approximately how I would rate the difference between students of former generations and students during the past 15 years. Milton as a life-changing experience versus Milton as the occasion to get the grade one wants or does not want, especially the latter. How can grade consciousness be such a bad thing? Let me count the ways. To begin, an obsession with grades creates a false motivation for learning. A false motivation for learning. The motivation for doing one's best ought to be the sheer love of learning, pursued in a spirit of stewardship to God, in gratitude for the opportunity that He has given to learn. Several years ago, a student sat in my office, threw her hands up, very histrionically I will say, and declaimed, "I give up." What this meant was that because this student had not risen to the A level in my Shakespeare course, she had no remaining motivation to exert herself in my course. This person had no sense that knowledge is its own reward, that it is a privilege to be learning, and that the right motivation to do one's best is not an A, but a sense of being a good steward of the opportunities to learn that God has given. Why, incidentally, did this student pay me a visit to announce that she, quote, gave up? She paid me the visit to make sure that I understood that it was my fault, that she had no motivation to exert herself. One of my students who graduated several years ago, in explaining why she had not taken a course from me that she had earlier expressed enthusiasm in taking, told me that I had made her feel like a failure and did not give her the encouragement that she needed, when no matter how hard she tried, she did not rise above a B in my Shakespeare class. When I was clearing out extraneous stuff from my office, I ran across a letter from a student written to me after this student had transferred to another college, in which he claimed that by giving him a B in a writing course, I had not given him the encouragement that he needed. This is an impossible burden to put on a teacher, and it springs from an overemphasis on grades. Another reason why grade obsession is a spiritual issue is that it represents a buying into the success ethic that has such a stranglehold on our culture. The Bible does not endorse the success ethic. Part of the poison of the success ethic is the false notion of identity that it gives us. The success ethic tells us that our identity rests in our performance. A Christian's identity is as a new creature in Christ. To students and parents who are enamored of the success ethic, we need to assert, and I tell my students, the principle found in Jeremiah 45, verse 5, "Do you seek great things for yourself? Seek them not." I tell my students truthfully that one of my cherished goals as a teacher is that God will raise up students who can be B students to the glory of God. I have an address intended for Christian school parents, and one of the points I make to them is that young people often think that they need to get an A in order to please their parents, even though parents do not know this, and may in fact have said nothing to induce their child's response. So you may need to talk to your parents about grade consciousness and false notions of identity and unchristian notions about what it takes to please God and parents. As we analyze current trends in the youth culture, something surely needs to be said about the legacy of the technological revolution, and especially what we call the electronic generation of young people. While I cannot prove that the electronic and digital media have dulled the excitement for learning that was once more evident in young people, something has happened. And since it coincided with the electronic revolution, it is hard to resist the conclusion that the two are related. Aristotle claimed that all people by nature desire to know. And he also claimed that to learn gives the liveliest pleasure. Cicero said that the pursuit of knowledge is rooted in human nature, adding that, quote, "We are all of us drawn to the pursuit of knowledge." Matthew Arnold claimed that all knowledge is interesting to a wise person, and he also repeatedly appealed to human nature as the motivation that can be trusted to drive people to want a liberal education. Well, something has happened between then and now. I believe that to some extent the transition happened during my 4.5 decades as a teacher, and it is a great sadness to me to have lived through this decline. The distractions of technology are certainly one of the most important ingredients in the decline that I have asserted. Much of the time and interest that once went into learning is now spent chasing after and using the latest piece of technology. You have seen that. The time and interest that once went into learning is now spent chasing after and using the latest piece of technology. When I see students walking across my campus, one of the most common sights that I see is students reading their text in a handheld device. The knowledge base of students who spend hours texting is extremely narrow. What these young people know is what their friends are doing and thinking. I will just add, sarcastically, big deal. In a recent summer, when I was with the Wheaton in England program in Oxford, my colleague had a near riot on her hands when she disseminated the ground rules for the final paper in her Romanticism course. When this colleague went into the computer lab that evening, she found that over half of the Wheaton students in the room were on Facebook. What I have discerned is not primarily a decline in students' intellectual ability, but rather a loss of the thrill once common to be learning something new. The situation is not hopeless, but the feat of students catching what I call the intellectual spark is much more difficult to attain in the electronic and digital age than it was before. Compared to my students of 3 and 4 decades ago, my students do not value the academic and classroom experience highly. I will say again, if I had Veritas students largely, it would be a very different picture. On a Wheaton in England program, I recall walking behind a pair of students who were discussing what they had valued most highly in their Wheaton experience. I overheard a good and thoughtful student, an intellectual I would judge, clinch his narrative with the summary statement, "Really, all my best experiences at Wheaton have been non-academic ones." I also had a football player tell me shortly before his graduation that, quote, 99% of my experience at Wheaton has been football. As the doctor says in the sleepwalking scene in Shakespeare's Macbeth, well. I am in danger of saying too much that is negative about the academic scene. So instead of saying more, I will briefly fill out my analysis by citing 3 additional categories that a Christian college president elaborated in a blog posting about today's college students. 1, students are overconnected. Overconnected, yes. With email, Facebook, cell phones, text messaging, and Starbucks conferences. Where is the time to study in that flurry of interaction? Secondly, said the college president, many young people are overprotected by parents. Thirdly, students are overserved. Many of them have been conditioned by their upbringing and current level of affluence to live virtually all of their lives as consumers who are entitled to have their desires met. It just happens automatically. And I grant there are no easy solutions. We all want the best for our children, and I understand that. I regret to say that colleges feed and water this mentality in the recruitment process and subsequently by programs designed to retain students after they have enrolled. Many students live their lives, including their academic lives, as perpetual self-focused consumers. I have a humorous anecdote on the subject. Several years ago, I spoke at a Christian college, and Mary and I had occasion to marvel at the new student center on campus. Our tour guide confided that when the student center was in the process of being designed, the architect was told, make it look like a shopping mall, because that is what young people are accustomed to. And we looked around, and yes, the student center looked like a shopping mall. A related phenomenon is the sense of entitlement that our young people have absorbed, partly as a result of an incipient self-esteem movement that has been going on in our culture for a long time, partly as a result of the entitled movement itself, and partly as the result of parents having made their children accustomed to receiving every possible experience and possession that family finances allow. Allow me to summarize what I have covered in this address. I have delivered a good news, bad news message. The good news is the mission and vocation that are ours as guardians of a noble ideal, Christian liberal arts learning, education in godliness, and equipping students with skill for living all of life. What higher calling can you imagine? Then when I talked about the virtues required to pursue the calling of being a Christian student and scholar, a few clouds appeared in the sky, as we intuitively sense that this is not an auspicious time in history to practice those virtues. Then as I talked about obstacles that lie in the path of exercising the scholarly virtues, it became very obvious that we do not teach at a school in utopia. In the title of this address, I included the idea that as teachers we have a role in nurturing our students' sense of Christian vocation in regard to their life as a student. Let me briefly address that subject. First, the ideal toward which we aspire, and that students 3 decades ago embraced more fully than they do now, remains in place. The goal is still there. We need to keep affirming it and placing it in our students' awareness. I myself have not altered what I do and say in the classroom simply because students have fallen prey to the habits and cultural trends that I've outlined in this address. I still do what I did 45 years ago. I have come to have lower expectations in regard to the results of my effort. As teachers, we need to be idealists, even in circumstances that make it difficult or less fruitful than it once was. It is no longer completely the case that all my students by nature desire to know. Nonetheless, some of my students still have that desire, and all of them have some remnant of the desire. Additionally, I believe that we need to hold a mirror up to our students. We need to call their attention to the things that I have covered in this address. We need to be a voice of conscience. Of course, we need to be tactful and non-judgmental in that role. Still, we do not wish to be like the father of Adonijah, who, quote, had never at any time displeased his son by asking, "Why have you done thus and so?" 1 Kings 1, verse 6. There are times and occasions when we need to ask our students why they have done thus and so. I want to end on a positive note by sharing a few of my favorite quotations from some of my favorite people, the original Puritans, on the vocation of being a teacher and by extension an administrator. I have chosen passages that capture the blend of optimism and realism that I believe constitute our daily calling in the classroom and out of it. As a lead into my first quotation, I need to clue you in that one of the most commonly paired nouns in Puritan polemics, especially in arguments in favor of having an educated clergy, were the words godly and learned. They were just almost an automatic formula. And further, that the common Puritan adjective painful was very positive in association. A painful preacher. It meant painstaking, attentive to details. Richard Bernard at one point encouraged wealthy people to support education and commended benefactors who had helped, quote, to erect and maintain all nurseries of piety and good learning. That's another common pair, piety and good learning. He added, be liberal in this way and destinate some of the portion of your wealth to so gracious and glorious work. Make choice of pious, painful, learned, and laborious schoolmasters. Bernard continued, allow him a large and liberal stipend for his encouragement, for it is a thankless, tedious, and Herculean labor which few either will or can undertake. Richard Bernard also wrote that common people respect more a good teacher's life than his learning, and reverence the person and not his preaching so much. Richard Steele divided the various callings of life into categories and placed the teacher's calling in the spiritual realm. Quote, some callings are employed chiefly about the soul, as schoolmasters, tutors in arts and sciences, and particularly divines, meaning ministers, which, though they be often poor trades, yet are always rich callings. The Puritans had a theory of general calling by which they meant the call to live the life of Christian faith and holiness that comes to all Christians, and the particular callings or tasks to which God calls us. Here's William Perkins on the need to integrate the two callings. Every particular calling must be practiced in and with the general calling of a Christian. It is not sufficient for persons in the congregation and in conversation to be Christian at church, but in their very personal calling they must show themselves to be so. Schoolmasters must not only be Christian in the assembly, meaning at church, when they hear the word and receive the sacraments, but they must also show themselves to be Christian in the office of teaching. And therefore both callings must be joined, as body and soul are joined in a living person. And that we may the better join both our callings together, we must consider the main end of our lives, and that is to serve God in the serving of people and the works of our callings. John Preston said this about the benefits of knowledge. Knowledge is the oil, as it were, wherein the flame of the Spirit lives, and you cannot have more grace than you have knowledge. There is not a new notion that a person gets. There is not a beam of new truth. There is not a further enlargement of knowledge and illumination, but it brings some riches of grace with it. It comes not empty, but it comes laden with something. It has some power and strength, and it gives a new vigor to the inward person. Richard Baxter wrote, "A schoolmaster's calling is usually but poor and very painful, requiring much close attendance, but yet it is of so great use to the common good, and alloweth the mind so much leisure and advantage to improve itself in honest studies, that it is the fitter to be chosen and delighted in by a well-tempered mind than richer and more honored employments. It is sweet to be all day doing so much good." It's a high ideal. It is sweet to be all day doing so much good. Thomas Gattaker said regarding teachers, "Who come nearer to ministers than schoolmasters do? What is their school but a private church, if it be ordered as it ought? If Christian families be so, Christian schools much more. And further, as therefore you are called to be teachers and are called to teach, so be you careful to answer your name to be that you are termed. Apply yourselves with alacrity, fidelity, and diligence to this necessary, to this worthy work. Neither let it discourage you if you meet with some foolish and unthankful persons or parents, that shall either slenderly consider your travail, or con you little thanks for your labor. Do your duty faithfully and constantly, and as the prophet said of himself, your work shall be with God, and your wages with him. He will regard and reward you, whether men do or no. Do your best endeavor, and let the event be what it will, you shall have from God whose work you do, when you do conscionably what you do, according to your pains, not according to the issue or event of it. Finally, when you lament how early you make it to school, be encouraged with these words from William Burkitt, and I really wave this flag when I have an early morning class. Remember that the morning hours are the flower of your time, and that early rising makes at once both the body healthful and the soul holy. The morning is the best time for enjoying God and ourselves. Then are our spirits fresh and our hearts free from worldly cares. Thank you.